I'm Susan Fox Rogers. I am that very happy editor of this anthology from which both Jenn Dean and Thomas Bancroft will be reading from tonight. I want to thank Jessica and Sally from BirdNote for inviting us to this event. BirdNote being one of the great bird shows that is available through NPR and a podcast, and you should all listen to it. So this storytelling series, this is the second that we've done. We did our first one at the end of June, and it was a lot of fun. And so here we are again for some stories from this collection. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the book. That it was born from my two passions, birds and reading books, words. And I started birding only 10 years ago, and I took to it like a convert, and both the reading and the birding. And so I decided, and I'm an editor. This is now the 12th anthology that I've edited. And so I decided to put together this book because I was reading so much great writing about birds written by contemporary writers. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to edit this collection. So I think one of the things that's fun for me as an editor, there's lots of aspects of this that I think are wonderful, but one of the fun things is finding the writers. In this case, I wrote to people whose work I had read, who I admired, and they sent me their work, or they totally ignored me, one way or the other. And in the case of our two writers tonight, Jenn Dean, I met. I went to the luncheon for the John Burroughs Award, and John Burroughs is sort of the nature writer of the 19th century, especially on the East Coast. He's a Catskill mountain writer. Somebody who I enjoy. He writes magnificently about birds, and they give out these awards every year for the best book, the best essay, the best children's book, and they pick wonderful things. And so I went to the luncheon. A friend of mine, Lynn Fagan, invited me to the luncheon, and it's not the kind of thing I ever go to. Is at the Yale Club, and I was kind of not that excited about going. And then I was seated next to Jenn, so I got to meet her and read her spectacular essay, which had been published in the Massachusetts Review, and had won the essay prize from the Burroughs Society that year. And so we started a correspondence, and she was kind enough to let me use her magnificent essay in this collection. And then Thomas, I was actually trying to remember your essay. Just sort of, we've never met in person. We've only met in Zoom. We haven't shared a lunch together at the Yale Club.
No, right.
So you must have heard about the anthology.
Wow.
I found it online and submitted an essay for consideration. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, so this is not a case of, I knew him, or I was just sort of out of the blue. It was such a beautiful essay, I decided to include it. So I feel really lucky to have both of these pieces. And one of the things another thing that's fun about editing a collection like this is that there's great texture here. And I think that the two writers tonight is a great example of that. Jenn's piece, more a journalistic piece. It has a personal element to it, but it's definitely looking outward and doing a lot of research, which I find both bold and exciting, and the kind of thing that I would be incapable of, especially her persistence in getting to these birds that she wanted to see. And then Thomas's piece is much more of a memoir. So of a lifetime, unlike me, who became a bird 10 years ago. This is more a case of somebody who's been a birder his whole life. So we're going to begin with Jenn, who's going to speak to us a little bit about the Cahow and read to us. She has an MFA from Bennington and has a connection with BirdNote. Are you on the board now? I'm not even sure. You were on the board. No.
No. I was on the production team briefly. I did a little bit of editing for their website.
Okay, so familiar with BirdNote. She's at work on a book now, and you might tell us a little bit about that as well. But I give you Jenn Dean.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, Susan, for those very kind words. I am really thrilled to be included in Susan's book, and I'm super excited to talk to you all today because BirdNote is near and dear to my heart, and I'm honored to present with Thomas and finally meet him on Zoom because I read his marvelous essay. And what I thought I would do today is I'm going to introduce the story, read a little bit, show you some slides and read a little bit more and sort of tell you the backstory behind the story. I was, as Susan calls me, persistent, but I was very lucky. I think a lot of how I got this story was a lot of luck. So as she said, my piece takes place on Bermuda, and it's about the other ghost bird. There's, I think everyone calls the ivory-billed woodpecker the ghost bird, but this is about a different bird. And feel free to pour yourself some rum. I do not have rum in this coffee cup here. It is just coffee. So a little backstory first about early Bermuda. If you've been to Bermuda today, it may be hard to believe, but early sailors really hated the place. During the 15th and 16th centuries, they called it a pit of hell in the North Atlantic. And that was because it had these violent storms surrounding the archipelago, and it was surrounded by these acres and acres of very dangerous reefs. So as a result, there were a ton of shipwrecks. And on top of that, they heard like these demonic sounds coming from the island at certain times of the year. And so long before the birth of the, whatever they called it, the Bermuda Triangle, they used to call it the Isle of Devils, and that's how it was marked on maps. In 1609, along comes a ship called the Sea Venture. It was a resupply ship. It was bound for Jamestown Colony, and that wrecked on Bermuda. And essentially that started continuous human habitation of the island. And those people found not a pit of hell, but they found paradise. They, in their early accounts, they say there were so many sea turtles, you could walk across their backs, across the bay on the backs of the sea turtles. They found a lot of fish, a lot of berries. So there was a lot of abundance there. And around November of that year, they discovered the source of those demonic cries, and it was actually a bird. And they called it the Cahow after this weird, drawn out, addled whoop that it made. And what they didn't know is that it was a gadfly petrel. It was a small football-shaped bird. And from November to March, during that time, essentially Bermuda was a gigantic seabird colony. They estimate that about 500,000 of these birds came to breed on that island. It was a pelagic bird, so it lived at sea, it was nocturnal, and it came to Bermuda only to breed. And what the bird would do was pretty remarkable. It would dig these long, like 12-foot tunnels, and it was curved at the end to keep light out. And it would lay a single egg. And then when that chick hatched and dried, the parents would climb up the low-growing endemic cedar trees that furred this island back then. They were just these really low cedar trees. And then they would fling themselves into the wind. And they climbed the trees. They were able to climb the trees because they had these little nails on the end of their webbed feet. So this was a pretty remarkable bird, right? It could dig these long tunnels, it could climb trees, and it lived at sea for most of the year. Unfortunately, as was the case with many species, they weren't afraid of people. And so the early settlers, looking for food, they learned that if they put their arms out like this, the birds would just land on them, and then they could club them to death. And then they went out and collected their eggs. So by 1620, only 11 years after the Sea Venture wrecked, there's no more mention of this bird in those early accounts, right? It was essentially wiped out. And it had been living on Bermuda for 37 million years. But fast forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and now Bermuda is a military base at this point. And the officers who were stationed there were interested in kind of looking into Bermuda's natural history. Now, avian experts at that time said, hey, look, this bird is extinct. It no longer exists. It was Pterodroma Cahow or the Bermuda Petrel. There's just none of them are left. But locals thought otherwise. There were fishermen who claimed to hear it during certain times of the year. There were other people who found like dead mystery birds. Bones would turn up in caves. Then there was a whole bunch of other people who said, nah, it really wasn't a Cahow. It was a dusky shearwater, because they had a lot of them on the island. So there was a lot of confusion and intrigue surrounding the bird's supposed demise and whether or not it was still alive. And that's where we pick up the story. As a young boy growing up in Bermuda in the late 1930s, David Wingate knew the Cahow's storied history as well as its supposed extinction. A burgeoning naturalist, ridiculed by his peers for his love of nature and discouraged by teachers for his interest in birds, he often showed his drawings to Lewis Mowbray, head of the Bermuda Aquarium. Mowbray encouraged the young Wingate's nature studies and always made him feel as if he was, quote, on the brink of something really important. Wingate, whose alienation led him further into Bermuda's natural world, wandered into a cave one day and found a set of skull and wing bones. He recalls his epiphany. I climbed up out of the cave and I looked up, and in the distance, I could see the Castle Harbor Island shining on the horizon, and the hair just went up on the back of my neck. It seemed impossible that the Cahow had been able to survive, but I had to believe it if I wanted to find it alive. Motivated by his belief, he built a kayak in the summer of 1950 with the help of some friends, and then paddled across the open ocean until he reached one of the islets in Castle Harbor. Bermuda's cantankerous seas prevented him from landing on the sharp limestone. He vowed to return the following spring. What he didn't know is that he would return, but alongside two of the world's most acclaimed avian naturalists. Although the outside world had forgotten about the Cahow, one man hadn't. Dr. Robert Murphy, a petrel expert and renowned ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Murphy and Lewis Mowbray risked their reputations to do one last thorough search. Ornithologists look for rare birds all the time, but this was different. How could a Cahow population be plausible if it needed forest cover and dirt to burrow in? Bermuda's building boom had begun. Roads crisscrossed hitherto wild places, and houses sprouted all over the archipelago. If the bird still existed, it was likely offshore somewhere in Castle Harbor. But during World War II, in an agreement with the American military, some of the Castle Harbor islands were filled in to form an airport. If Cahows nested there, their burrows would have been paved over. The remaining islets in Castle Harbor consisted of hard limestone no bird could possibly dig into. So in scientific circles, the idea of a search provoked skepticism and even ridicule. And actually, there were scientists who thought that this search was akin to a search for Bigfoot, so they kept it really quiet. The two men still believed the bird just might have survived in the rocks somewhere. After he secured grant money, Murphy flew to Bermuda in January of 1951. Mowbray suggested they bring the 15-year-old Wingate along, and Murphy agreed. A sure-footed boy could more easily scramble around the limestone. They set a date to begin their search, Thursday, January 25th, when the birds might be in burrows incubating. But Wingate, stuck at Saltus Grammar School, couldn't participate until the weekend. In a stroke of magnificent fortune for Wingate, a January gale blew through, and the two men were unable to launch in Castle Harbor. On Sunday, the seas calmed, and this time, with young Wingate on board, they set out. They used code words to disguise locations, calling the first island they approached Island A. Finding numerous crevices with seabird excreta in the openings, they chose a burrow with fresh footprints in front of it. They dug it out partially until they spotted a bird in the darkness. Could it be the fated Cahow? It took them hours to fashion a noose on the end of a bamboo pole. Finally, Mowbray fished the pole in, snared the bird's leg, but with a gentle tug, pulled it out into the light. The bird flapped its wings and blinked in the sunlight. Murphy scooped it up and held it aloft. By gad, the Cahow, he exclaimed under his breath, a phrase repeated in newspaper headlines around the world. The bird settled and bowed its head as if paying homage to its future saviors. Photographs show its vanilla forehead, its ash-colored back, its curved beak, its wings stretched open. Their discovery was akin to finding a live pterodactyl. The bird did more than emerge from the limestone. It emerged from nearly 350 years of extinction. They eventually found 8 breeding pairs in the Castle Harbor Islands. Endemic to Bermuda, the Cahow they would learn came there only to breed, only at night, and only to 4 remote islets. For Wingate, as he stood watching Murphy hold the bird up to the sun, the course of his life became clear. As the turquoise water glistened all around, Wingate decided to devote his life to saving the Cahow. And some say the seabird saved his life as well. In response to the discovery, Bermuda's government set aside the Castle Harbor Islands as a nature reserve, but it was almost too late. The Cahow was rediscovered just as it teetered on the brink of true extinction. Forced off the mainland by humans, unable to dig holes in rock, the birds lived in whatever holes they could find, often competing for nest sites with the more aggressive Bermuda longtail, a black and white bird resembling an angel crossed with a flying rat. For you birders out there, that's the white-tailed tropic bird, but they call it the Bermuda longtail. The longtails often peck the petrel fledglings to death in order to claim the shallow cliff-face burrows, and at one point, less than 10 petrel fledglings existed in the world. Wingate, who helped the recovery project as he completed high school and took over after college, believed the Cahow population might die off for good until he discovered 10 more nesting pairs. But the bird faced other challenges. Rats swam over to the islands and ate their eggs, and when fledglings took their inaugural flights with nothing to climb up on, they jumped off of cliffs, often bouncing off rocks and landing in the water. Since the Cahows lost their habitat, Wingate decided he would recreate it for them. On the outlying islets, he constructed cement burrows, or what he called government housing, for the Cahows. The cement igloos had long, curved entry tunnels to keep out light, and each had a lid to make observation of the nesting chamber easier. He installed custom-made baffles to keep out the longtails. He then constructed smaller igloos the size of upside-down serving bowls for them. His focus soon turned to Nonsuch, the largest, most protected Castle Harbor island, a place he believed might make the perfect Cahow colony. But by the 1950s, the 15-acre island resembled a blistered mess. Overgrazed, tunneled by rats, covered with invasive plants, the island was an ecological junkyard. But Wingate, having witnessed the building boom on the mainland while growing up, saw the potential for Nonsuch, not just as a future Cahow nesting site, but also as a living museum encompassing all of Bermuda's threatened flora and fauna. And it was there that he set out to create a miniature pre-Columbian Bermuda. Now I'm going to show you, let me see if I can do this correctly. Here we go. Susan, let me know if you can't see that. I think you should all be able to see that. So this is the famous rediscovery photo. This is Murphy and Mowbray holding the bird aloft. What you can't see is an identifying field mark of this bird, which is a smudgy thumbprint on the underside of the outer wings, but I will show that to you shortly. Just to give you some scale, Bermuda is only 21 square miles, and that arrow in the upper right-hand corner, that points to Nonsuch Island, and the birds are nesting in these little rocky things off of that. So you can see what a tiny habitat they have. This is Nonsuch in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. So this is me in 2002, one of my first visits to the island. And how I found out about this story is that I asked my taxi driver, this exuberant woman named Foxy, where I could go to see birds. And she said, David Wingate, the Cahow, Nonsuch. And honestly, I had no idea what she was talking about. But here I am the next day, I'm on my way to Nonsuch. This is the dock at Nonsuch, or it was the dock at Nonsuch. That sunken ship was sunk by William Beebe in the 1930s as like a fish tank for his studies. Not quite sure how that worked, but. And this is David Wingate at the time that I met him in 2002. And at this time, he was retiring and the project was in transition to his second in command, Jeremy Medeiros. He has spent his life tirelessly restoring the island to 5 different habitats, monitoring the chicks during the winter season. His young family would move over to the island with him. He had 2 girls and a wife. He campaigned against DDT, he gave tours, he raised money. And he just has spent his life, he's been completely devoted to this bird. Next to him on the ground there on the right, that little igloo, that's what he made for the longtails. And this is what he made for the Cahow. So this is the long tunnel curved at the end, and that little thing is where you get into the nesting chamber. You can see how close Nonesuch is to mainland Bermuda. You can see mainland Bermuda in the top of that slide. This is Wingate again. He was very unassuming. I included this slide to show what a muted palette this restored pre-Columbian vegetation has. When I went back to the mainland that day, it resembled Disneyland. It's like all garish with flowers and, you know, exotic palm trees. This is one of the rocky islets that the birds were nesting on, and this is a view from Nonesuch. So you can see how vulnerable these little pieces of land are to climate change, rising seas, increasingly large hurricanes. This is a view from Nonesuch of the famous island A of the rediscovery. The reason that David called the bird the ghost bird is because even though he lived pretty intimately with it, there were still a lot of things that were trying to discover about the bird even at that time. So that's why he called it the ghost bird, because it remained as spectral and cryptic to him as a ghost. With Nonesuch restored, the birds still weren't coming to nest there. And so I didn't see any birds that day, but I became really obsessed with this bird just because of its fantastic abilities, and it's a mystery. And so even though everyone on Bermuda knows David Wingate and they know about the Cahow, no one sees this bird because it's nocturnal and pelagic. So fast forward to 4 years later. I'm still living in Boston at the time. I'm about to move to Seattle, and I couldn't stop thinking about this bird, and I wanted to find out why the Cahow mattered. And I had a free ticket to Bermuda, and I had 3 days in March, and that was all I had. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go there and maybe I can track down Jeremy and go out and like help him ban chicks or something. But that was like a pipe dream, right? I'm not a journalist. I had a flip phone. This is 2006, that didn't work on the island. So I resorted to like using this little payphone at the guest house I was staying at, and my camera broke. So I had this like really horrible disposable camera. Anyways, for 2 days, I'm like desperately trying to get a hold of this guy, leaving messages. And on my last day in Bermuda, I managed to go, went to the aquarium, and the staff took pity on me. They knew I had been trying to get a hold of him. So they called his wife. She gets on the phone with me and says, he always checks in with me. I know you're leaving the next day. I'll call you back. So she calls back a little while later, and she said, meet him at the Tuckerstown dock at 3 o'clock. So I'm like, oh my God. So I raced down there. I don't have the disposable camera with me because I didn't think this was going to happen. I had a notebook, and my pen ran out of ink. So on the landing there, which it's not really a dock, it's like a dip in the pavement. And then, you know, this boat was going to pick me up. There's a garbage can. So I'm fishing around in the garbage can. This is the glamorous life of nature writing, right? I'm fishing around the garbage can, and I found a working pen. And lo and behold, Jeremy comes around the corner, and I'm going to do another share screen here and show you what happened next. We went out to, he took me out with him to ban chicks. And if I could unmute you all, I hope you're all saying, aw, because these are obviously not the photos I took that day because I didn't have my camera, but this is exactly what they look like. And they are so adorable. They're about the size of a grapefruit. Jeremy calls them dust bunnies, and they make little weep, weep noises. And so that's what we did. We went around to a couple different islands and took them out of the nesting chamber just like that. And he explained at that time, they had figured out why the birds weren't going to Nonesuch to nest. And the reason that they weren't going to Nonesuch to nest is right before these birds fledge, they come out at night and they exercise their little wings, right? Because they're getting ready to become an adult and fly. And they look up at the stars at night and they bob their heads back and forth and they memorize the position of the stars. So when they fledge, they go out to sea for 3 to 5 years. They come back to land and they land within a meter of where they were born. I mean, that's remarkable. So they had figured this out, and what they were doing, they hadn't wanted to handle these birds because they thought they would die from stress, but they figured out that wasn't going to happen either. So they started this translocation project. They would put them in tomato boxes during the day and move them over to Nonesuch and put them in one of these government housing burrows that they made for them right before they're ready to fledge. And because their parents couldn't find them anymore, they would have volunteers hand feed them, and the birds were starting to fledge from Nonesuch. So that was pretty remarkable to go out there and do that with Jeremy. But then what happened was he told me that we were on the famous Island A of the rediscovery. And I'm just going to read to you what happened next, because it was far beyond my wildest dreams. Pointing to another gray limestone bluff separated from us by water, Medeiros told me an adult bird was incubating a failed egg over there. If I wanted to see an adult Cahow, a bird so rare that only a handful of people have seen it and handled it, a bird most native Bermudians have never seen, even though it's their national bird, this was my chance. We slid down a steep embankment to sea level. A tilted boulder made a makeshift bridge over to the rest of the island, but the sea washed over it at intervals. We waited, then jumped. We scrambled up a cliff. The sun slanted from the west and the limestone shone white. I was shivering. The rocks plunged straight down to the ocean. Medeiros found the nest entrance under a ledge. He pointed to the sand in front of the hole. The webbed footprints pointed in, but none pointed out. There's an adult bird in there, all right. I kneeled next to him as he lifted the concrete lid off. Then he plunged in his arm and pulled out a full-grown adult Cahow by the back end. There are times in your life that become touchstones that define all else that came before and all else that will follow. Nothing prepared me for this living dinosaur. The vanilla forehead fading into charcoal, the liquid black eyes, the torpedo-sleek body, sturdy but soft, the dark feet set back on its body, ending in the webbed and nailed toes that evolution gave it. It glowed in his arms. I was face to face with the ghost bird, one of the rarest seabirds on the planet. He flipped the bird onto its back and cradled it. This one's unbanded, he said. I reached out to stroke its stomach. The bird bent its neck up and bit my hand. That's your souvenir, he said. We laughed. Then he slipped the bird into a soft bag and had me hold it while he retrieved a band. I cradled it upside down against my chest. The cliff fell away to the sea, not 6 inches from my right foot. I was holding a pterodactyl in my arms. I was holding the dodo, the auk, and 1,000 other birds, all the birds that had evolved and gone extinct before Bermuda was first discovered. I lowered my head and inhaled the musky scent of its ancient body, a soft, sour, not unpleasant odor. In his essay, The Lives of a Cell, Lewis Thomas says, it is illusion to think there is anything fragile about the life of the earth. We are the delicate part, transient and vulnerable as cilia. Medeiros had told me that they were tough survivors, but I hadn't grasped it until now. I sensed its tenacious heart, its resolve to survive, and I understood that Cahow was as tough as the earth, that it would go on despite us, and that we, with our cars and wars and money and petty concerns and selfish genes, remained wasted and trivial. And I'm just going to show you a few more photos because I can't take you this far and not show you an adult Cahow. So this is what they look like. And there's just something beautiful and spooky about these birds. It's captivating. They're not like charismatic megafauna. They're not like elephants or lions or eagles, but they're just, nature doesn't make anything that's not incredible, right? They're Bermuda's national birds. They're on their money. And if you go to if you look at the bottom right of the screen, nonesuchisland.com, if you go there, you can sign up for tour notifications in case they open this up for tours again, which I hope they do in the future. And now they've got nest cams and you can watch Cahows lay eggs. They didn't have that back in the time that I was researching this. And they've actually put transmitters on them. So they know they go like something crazy, like 2,000 miles in search of food for their young. This past nesting season, they're now up to, I think when I was there in 2006, they were up to like 200 birds. Now they're up to 142 breeding pairs, and 26 of those breeding pairs are on Nonesuch Island. This is one of my favorite photographs of Jeremy with two of the adults. They're just stunning. And this is the underside of the Cahow. So you can see the smudgy thumbprint, the identifying field mark of it for you birders out there, at the under edge of the wing. And I just want to leave you with this, that this is a story of survival and hope. And, you know, God knows we need those stories in this day and age. And as Jeremy told me that day, he said, if we can do it with this, we can do it with anything. So thank you so much for listening and for having me.
That was simply fabulous. Thank you, Jen. It is exactly the story that we need at this time, I think, in so many ways. And how gripping hearing you telling it in this way and seeing the images of the birds. And that baby Cahow is maybe the cutest thing I've ever seen.
They really are.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. So now we're going to have Thomas read to us. He is a writer and a photographer with a PhD in ornithology. So we have our scientist in the room. He has worked for both the Wilderness Society and for National Audubon. And he has devoted his life to the protection of wild places and of birds as well. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Susan. That was wonderful, Jen. Really fun story to hear about, and fun conservation success there and bringing those back. You know, I'm going to tell a little story here. And at the time that this story takes place, I was living here in an apartment that I affectionately now call my dungeon, and trying to decide what to do with the rest of my life here at that point. So, but before we get started, I thought I would share with you what this little bird that's going to be a centerpiece of this story looks like. So this is a ruby-crowned kinglet. They're about a little bit over 4 inches long. If they spread their wings all the way out, they're a little bit over 7 inches wide. So he's a little tiny guy.
I don't think screen is sharing though, Thomas.
Oh, I never shared, huh?
Oh, yeah, I don't think, yeah, hit that green thing at the bottom that says sharing.
All right.
We'll get you.
All right. All right. Now we got it.
Perfect.
All right. So this is a ruby-crowned kinglet. And as I said, they're little guys, about 4 inches, a little bit over 4 inches long. When they spread their wings, that's about 7 inches, 7 1/4. So they're little tiny. They weigh about 1/4 of an ounce. And, you know, I was lucky to see these on a nice cold winter day. There you can see a little bit of red on the top. That's a male. The female doesn't have that little bit of red. Sometimes that red doesn't show. And they were feeding down low near the ground. So let me get back out. So that's what ruby-crowned kinglets look like. There's another one there, just little tiny guys. Again, you can see that little bit of top there. So that's the star for today. All right, this is my tribe. I yank my coat collar up higher around my neck and pull my wool cap down over my ears. It's 20 degrees, and the light breeze makes it cold even with thick layers of clothing. But the landscape has me stopping regularly to stare. White ice crystals cover the vegetation and millions of delicate jewels, and they glisten, sparkle, and flash in the early morning light. The sun, just barely above the eastern horizon, gives a warm cast to the vegetation and hoarfrost. I shuffle along this western Washington trail, and suddenly a flit appears behind some shimmering gem-covered leaves, and then flutters out into the open. A tiny ruby-crowned kinglet moves faster than a gymnast on high bars, jumping from branch to branch, peering under leaves, hovering briefly in front of curled white wrapped leaf before moving on. The movement is almost frantic, but not unusual for this miniature bird. Then a second one pops up from behind another weed. Both are only inches off the ground, working feverishly through the sparkling foliage on a mission. Normally, they forage high in the canopy of trees. The hoarfrost must be making food more available in these weeds. These small olive green birds with strong white wing bars and white eye rings don't seem fazed by these low temperatures. I pull my collar up tighter, drawing my head down into the down wrappings as I hop from foot to foot, watching them dash one way and then another. The first time I saw a ruby-crowned kinglet was in the spring of my sophomore year in high school. Some birding buddies and I had gone to Presque Isle on Lake Erie to look for spring migrants. Often during the third week of May, thousands of northbound birds congregate on this thin peninsula before making the overwater flight across the lake. My friends wanted to see as many spring warblers as possible. Many of these birds only pass through Pennsylvania from their Latin American homes to Canada's boreal forests where they breed. In the spring, these birds are brightly colored, singing, looking like they are ready for the senior prom. We had left Pittsburgh 2 hours before dawn, so we could be there for the morning feeding frenzy. John, our leader, was a lot like me, a skinny kid without much muscles and of similar height, but he was a senior, and even though only 2 years older, he seemed to know everything. John had seen in his life more than 200 species of birds, a feat I couldn't ever imagine matching. He talked about birds and the natural history of Western Pennsylvania. His voice sounded like a professor, and he had an air of authority about him. He seemed to know his plants too, and told us stories of looking for salamanders, including the hellbender, an aquatic salamander I never heard of. All this seeming limitless knowledge gave me hope that I could learn too. I'd wondered if he was shy in school like me, without many friends. His description of warblers, salamanders, and his outings in Pennsylvania were simple and straightforward, not like Charles. Charles, the junior, was heavy-set, but seemed strong, determined, and energetic. Each time John described something he'd seen, Charles had a story about something that was better. He'd seen more snow geese, a blue goose too. He had found a rare warbler, the Brewsters, a hybrid of the blue wing and golden wing. He always had seen more individuals, a closer look, or in some other way, one-up John. Dave, the last member in our car, was in my biology and geometry class, so I knew him better. He was quiet too, didn't say much on the drive to Presque Isle, but had clearly been birding for several years with people who had shown him lots of species. My car mates all seemed to have the field marks in their heads for more species of birds than I even knew existed. My mother liked birds and encouraged my interest in birds and had given me a pair of good binoculars the previous Christmas. But here was a group of people more experienced and excited about my passion than I'd ever seen. Most boys I knew in middle school and then high school focused only on sports, football, basketball, baseball, and girls. I never told them I liked birds. As the chatter buzzed through my car, I couldn't sit still. I'd found my tribe. At the park, we jumped out of the car and started down a narrow dirt trail into a thicket of deciduous trees. New light green leaves kept twitching in the imperceptible breeze, making me stop and put my binoculars on each movement. Just another leaf. My group began to move away, and I hurried to keep up, not wanting to miss anything. Then, just above eye level and along the left side of the trail, was a definite bird. I jumped with excitement, but still managed to find it with my binoculars as it flitted from branch to branch, checking under leaves on the twigs for things to eat. This little olive green bird, only a few inches long, must be one of the warblers we'd come to find. "Hey guys, I think I found a warbler here, but I don't know what kind. My mentors ran back along the trail, all finding the bird instantly. Oh, it's a ruby-crowned kinglet. They turned immediately to head back on their quest with hardly a glance at my find. My shoulders slumped and the air seemed to leave my body. But this bird seemed incredible to me, so delicate and yet active. I continued to watch the kinglet, mesmerized by its energy, how it flicked its wings, and with each hop, and how it could move so gracefully, an acrobat. Many more kinglets appeared throughout our search for warblers, and I continued to think they might be warblers, alerting my friends again. They started to ask, does it have wing bars and a white eye ring? If I said yes, they didn't pause in their quest for warblers. Finally, John tapped on my upper arm and said, don't worry about asking, as he pulled out the bird book. We had to all learn the first time. Here, see, these are the key field marks for kinglets. He pointed to the eye ring and wing bars. He then turned toward the back of the book and flipped through the warbler plates. See, these don't have wing bars and eye rings at the same time. And see how their body shape is a little different? Foraging behavior too. It takes time. You'll get it. Just keep asking. We don't mind. And he closed the book and hurried down the trail, adding, let's find some warblers. I couldn't believe my good fortune in finding John, a person who loves sharing birds with a novice like me. Brightly colored spring warblers were abundant that day on Prescow, black-throated greens with their yellow cheek patch, green backs, and black throats. Black-throated blues with their white bellies and blue backs. Chestnut-sideds with their brownish stripe along their sides. Yellow warblers with their bright yellow bodies and red pinstripes, and so many more. Their songs sounded like soloists playing flutes, oboes, or violins. Each bird was dazzling, thrilling to see and hear, making me hungry for more. Our group considered it an outstanding day. We saw almost 24 warblers, plus tanagers, grosbeaks, flycatchers, sparrows. For me, though, each sighting of a ruby-crowned kinglet seemed remarkable. This drab olive gray bird, smaller than the warblers, would send a chill through my body, a thrill like Christmas morning when I was small. Something about it seemed special to my naive teenage eyes. Now, almost 50 years later, I still marvel at these little birds. These friends were amazing too. Although I've lost contact with them, I remember them as if it was yesterday. The kinglet in Washington did an acrobatic roll and grabbed a morsel, smaller than warblers, but yet they stay here in Washington and a few in Pennsylvania for the winter, while all those warblers head to Latin America. Kinglets weigh less than 2 small green grapes. These in front of me today have their feathers puffed out, making an airtight covering, much like a worn down quilt. But still in this cold, they will need lots of food to fuel their furnace. They need about 10 calories a day, the equivalent of 5 raisins. It takes a lot of arthropods, dormant spiders and insects and their eggs, to feed these little birds throughout the winter. Right now, these kinglets are focused methodically on fueling that grape engine, the most important thing for survival in the cold. I'm always amazed that these guys don't move farther south in the fall. Here in Washington, winter kinglets migrate down from high elevation spruce fir forests where they breed, or from Canadian breeding sites to live through the cold months in the Puget Sound lowlands. As they jump from foot to stay warm, they made me ponder my decision on where to live. Friends back east ask me the same question. How can I stand staying here in the rain and gloom of the Pacific Northwest? These little birds come only this far so that in the spring they don't have as far to fly to reach their breeding grounds. One hovers below a branch for the longest time, its wings going like a blur as it sticks its minute bill between frost-covered leaves. His scarlet crown patch shows briefly, a male. He disappears into the dense weeds. I came to Seattle to start over after my wife died. I found a good job, a girlfriend, But then the job disappeared and the girlfriend too. Most friends seemed to vanish at the same time, but a few stayed tight. My relatives, all in Pennsylvania, asked if I will move back east, but I seem to stay here. The kinglets dart among the bushes, madly searching. The hoarfrost crunches under my feet as I mince after them. These little birds are my tribe too. Several times I promised myself that I would decide what's next. In September, after spending the summer hiking, in July, when I finish the writing course, or after the next backpacking season. Yet I continue to stay, and those decision points come and go. There is something unique, mesmerizing about this place, the rain, the vegetation, the animals, the landscape. The resonance is strong. This country gives my body courage. These little kinglets epitomize active, energetic people focused on life. They have a laser focus on their needs. During the same year of high school as my first sighting of a kinglet, I had a gym teacher, call him Mr. Bob, who badgered me during PE. Even during an afternoon gym class, he wore no sign of a 5 o'clock shadow. I pictured him shaving between classes. His biceps bulged in his t-shirt and his thighs looked hard as steel. His sneakers were so white, he couldn't possibly have ever taken them outside. His face, though, was almost hollow. When I was trying, in vain, to do my push-ups, he would come down on one knee, lean over toward me and say, "Come on, Bancroft, can't you do more than that?" His neck muscles flexed in and out, in and out, in and out. Then he'd stand back up, grunt a few times, and walk away. Though I never once was able to lift my chin above the bar, Mr. Bob stood right beside me, his shoulders rising and falling, biceps flexing and flexing, as he spoke right into my ear. "Come on, Bancroft, what do you do on your farm anyways?" I never told him that I lived on a chicken farm, least of all Mr. Bob. Most of my high school classmates came from an affluent suburb of Pittsburgh, and one of their famous derogatory comments was to call somebody a farmer. Sick throughout my childhood, allergic to many common foods, as well as suffering from chronic asthma, I have never developed the muscles of a normal boy. And by the time I got to high school, I felt like a weakling, embarrassed by my lack of strength. Some, mostly the jocks, snickered in the background when Mr. Bob got on my case. Others would say to me in private, "Don't let him bother you." I endured Mr. Bob, the jocks in PE, and preserved birding with my tribe. Here in Washington, the ruby crown in front of me dashes along a wintry branch, wings twitching with each move. It peers left, then right, before hanging upside down on a side stem to pick a morsel from the underside of a leaf and gulp it. Many of the curled, frost-covered leaves are as big as the kinglet. Its white eye ring makes it look like it's wearing spectacles. Its eyelid repeatedly blinks as it twists to glare all around, scanning for more tidbits. This one lacks any scarlet in its crown, a female, and also pays me no heed. The female flies a few feet, and her frantic search reminds me of a saying my mother had. My mother used to say each time I didn't succeed at something, "Persistence and perseverance made a bishop of his reverence." I would stop and stare at her, not knowing what she meant at all, but not about to ask, for fear of having another of her famous phrases descend upon me. Kinglets survive in spite of the cold winter, in spite of all the predators that could eat them, in spite of the other birds that are bigger and feed on the same winter foods. They simply keep on going, not letting the Mr. Bobs of the world get them down. 50 years after my high school friends focused more on warblers, the Dematos bodies of kinglets and their pitcher-sized spirit still seize me. No is not an option for them. My fingers clench tight into a fist and back out again and again. The cold seeps through my mittens and socks. I flex up and down on my toes to push blood through my body. And yet I remain watching these miniature birds find morsel after morsel, moving quickly but methodically through this frost-covered patch, like they are pulling things from the kitchen cupboard for dinner. This is my home too. Thank you.
What a simply beautiful essay, and even more beautiful hearing you read it out loud to us. So
Oh, well, thank you.
thank you for that. That was just extraordinary. I hadn't thought about this ahead of time, the pairing of the two of you, but just sort of such different birds and the miracle of both of them, right? It's just the fact you capture so perfectly the size of the bird, and the fact that that it exists in these cold climates. It makes they're heroic, and then
Oh, they are, yeah. That's
yeah.
just it's still, every time I see him, it's like, how do you survive? How do you really do that? Yeah,
And how
yeah,
to make a house survive. I mean, it's just sort of the two of them. So
yeah.
that was just unbelievably moving. Yes. So we have a little bit of time here. If there are questions from uh, the audience, we could entertain some questions. These were just 2 of 24 essays in the collection. And if you want to read more from this, Cornell University Press is I'm sort of wavering this around. It's got this great cover, let's just admit. And if you want to order it from Cornell, they're offering a discount on the book. I'll put in the chat how to get your discount, 30% off the book. Obviously, it's also available from your independent bookstore and from Amazon. These are 2 fantastic essays in the collection, but as an unbiased, proud mother of this book, there's many others in the collection as well. So are there any questions here? Mostly just thank yous for your wonderful writing. There we go. There's the Cornell Press.
I just, maybe one thing to add is, I think I said at the beginning, I was living in an apartment at the time I went and saw that bird. The summer after that, I ended up buying a house in Seattle. So I think I'm here for a long, long time now. So this is my home now.
Any final thoughts from you as well, Jen? And
oh, sorry, go ahead, Sal.
There's a note here from Elaine about the fact that Sally is retiring, I believe. Is that true?
Yeah.
Well, I'm terribly grateful that I got to know you right as you're taking flight to the next thing, I imagine, right?
Thank you. Yeah, and this is such a wonderful way to end this week. I have one more week left, but the inspiration and the beautiful words will stay with me. So thanks so much, Tom and Jen, and to you, Susan, too.
Thank you, Sally, for everything you do for birds.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Sally has done a lot for birds and for BirdNote, the organization. So thank you, Sally. I'm going to loop back to just something someone said in the chat earlier. They had mentioned Lucinda Sperling's wonderful film called Rare Bird, which was, I believe, the first documentary. She's a native Bermudian, and she made a documentary about the Bermuda Petrel. You can't stream it anywhere. She actually gave me a copy when I met with her, and I mentioned her in my longer form of this essay, which was published in the Massachusetts Review. But someone asked, can we see this movie anywhere? And unfortunately, can't. My copy, for whatever reason, degraded, and I can't open it anymore. I'm thinking of emailing her and saying, hey, can I pay you for another copy? But it is worth mentioning that she is the first person and the first woman to capture on film these little fledglings doing that little head bobbing thing. And that's where I saw it take place. And it was just stunning. So anyhow, a shout out to Lucinda Sperling and her wonderful filmmaking.
Oh, extraordinary. Well, thank you everybody for being here on the East Coast anyway. It's a very hot day that we've had here. I don't know what, I think the last event we had, it was incredibly hot on the West Coast. So we were sort of swapping
Yeah.
our temperatures here. So thank you for everybody for joining us, and for to Thomas and to Jenn for these wonderful readings and these extraordinary stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Everybody have a great evening and enjoy the birds.
Yeah,
Enjoy the birds.
definitely. Enjoy the birds.
Fall migration is starting here. Shorebirds are coming through. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Good night.